August 25th, 1944. Highway Route Nationale 13, somewhere between Chartres and Paris, France. Corporal James Ruckard gripped the steering wheel of his GMC CCKW as the pre-dawn darkness began to fade over the French countryside. The 19-year-old from Maple Heights, Ohio, had been awake for 28 straight hours, and his hands trembled slightly as he wrote in his personal log during a brief fuel stop. The Germans couldn't stop us on the battlefield. Now we're in a race against time itself. Our tanks are advancing so fast across France that we might lose this war not because we lack fighting spirit, but because we cannot get gasoline to them fast enough. Through the dusty windshield, he watched an endless column of identical trucks stretching to both horizons, each one marked with a distinctive red ball painted on its canvas cover and hood. These weren't the sleek, sophisticated vehicles that military planners had envisioned winning World War II. They were simple, mass-produced workhorses, built with off-the-shelf civilian components, powered by engines that could be found in commercial delivery trucks across America. The cab was basic, the suspension crude, the design philosophy utterly utilitarian. Yet these unglamorous machines were about to accomplish something that would determine the fate of Europe and revolutionize modern warfare forever. Behind Ruckard, stacked carefully on the wooden truck bed and secured with rope and canvas straps, sat dozens of 5-gallon jerry cans filled with gasoline and wooden crates containing belted ammunition. 5,000 pounds of supplies that could keep an entire armoured company fighting for another week. Each jerrycan represented miles of movement for Sherman tanks pushing toward Germany. Each ammunition crate meant another German position could be neutralized. Without these supplies, the most powerful army ever assembled would become nothing more than well-armed pedestrians stranded in the French countryside. What none of these exhausted drivers knew was that this moment would change military history. The mathematics of Allied victory were being written not in battle casualties or territorial gains, but in ton-miles delivered per day, in maintenance hours versus operational hours, in fuel efficiency multiplied by reliability. A single truck, carrying 5,000 pounds of ammunition and gasoline, moving at an average of 35 miles per hour through recently liberated territory, would prove more decisive than the most powerful tank or strategic bomber. The race across France had begun, and the humble American truck was about to become the secret weapon that Nazi Germany never anticipated. The journey to this pivotal moment began on June 6, 1944, when 156,000 American, British, and Canadian troops stormed the beaches of Normandy in Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history. General Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had orchestrated a masterpiece of military planning. 5,000 ships crossed the English Channel under cover of darkness. 11,000 aircraft provided air support, dominating the skies over the invasion beaches. The invasion succeeded brilliantly, establishing a foothold on Hitler's fortress Europe that would never be relinquished. The beaches told different stories that bloody morning. At Utah Beach, American forces achieved their objectives with relatively light casualties, aided by currents that landed them in a less heavily defended area. At Omaha Beach, American soldiers faced a nightmare of withering fire from German positions on the bluffs above, suffering over 2,000 casualties before securing the beach through extraordinary courage. British and Canadian forces at Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches fought their way inland against stubborn German resistance, establishing beachheads that would become the launching point for the liberation of Western Europe. But even as the first wave of soldiers fought their way off the beaches, a logistical nightmare was already taking shape that threatened to undermine everything the Allies had achieved. Among those early arrivals was Lieutenant Charles Johnson of the 783rd Military Police Battalion, a 24-year-old former truck driver from Chicago who had enlisted in 1942. His diary, discovered decades later in the National Archives, would provide historians with the most detailed accounts of what became the greatest logistical operation of the war. Johnson wrote on June 8, 1944, "The invasion succeeded beyond our expectations. British and Canadian forces secured Gold, Juno, and Sword beaches. Americans took Utah and Omaha, though Omaha cost us dearly. But as I watched thousands of vehicles being unloaded onto those temporary docks, I wondered how we would ever keep them all supplied once they started moving inland. The French rail system was in ruins. We had destroyed it ourselves in the months before D-Day to prevent the Germans from bringing in reinforcements to throw us back into the sea. The irony was devastating and inescapable. In the months before the invasion, Allied strategic bombers had systematically destroyed French railway infrastructure. Bridges were demolished by precision bombing. Rail yards were obliterated in around-the-clock attacks. Marshalling stations were turned to rubble. Locomotives were strafed and destroyed wherever they were found. The strategy worked brilliantly for the invasion, preventing Germany from rapidly moving reinforcements to the Normandy beaches. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German defences in France, later complained that Allied air attacks made it impossible to move reserves effectively. Entire panzer divisions took weeks to reach the front when they should have arrived in days. But this successful pre-invasion strategy created an unprecedented challenge for the liberation campaign that would follow. Without functioning railroads, every bullet, every gallon of gasoline, every can of rations, every medical supply needed by advancing troops would have to be delivered by truck over roads that had been damaged by 4 years of occupation and warfare. The scale of this challenge was staggering. American forces alone would eventually field millions of men in France. Each soldier required approximately 67 pounds of supplies per day to remain combat effective. This included food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, replacement equipment, and fuel for vehicles. Multiply 67 pounds by millions of soldiers, and the logistics equation became almost unmanageable. The supply requirements grew exponentially with mechanization. An infantry division required approximately 650 tons of supplies daily. An armoured division needed over 1,000 tons per day. Artillery units consumed ammunition at prodigious rates during sustained operations. Tank battalions needed constant refueling. Vehicle maintenance required spare parts delivered continuously. Medical units needed supplies to treat casualties. The numbers were staggering and grew larger with each passing day as more forces landed in France. The first major test came in late July 1944 during Operation Cobra. After nearly 2 months of brutal fighting in the dense hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a fortress and every lane a death trap, American forces under General Omar Nelson Bradley finally broke through German defensive lines on July 25th. The breakthrough was sudden and spectacular. Over 2,500 American heavy bombers carpet-bombed German positions in a concentrated area, followed by ground assault that shattered enemy resistance. Suddenly, the slow grinding warfare of June and early July exploded into rapid mobile advance. General George Smith, Patton Jr.'s Third Army, which had been held in reserve waiting for exactly this moment, burst through the gap and began racing across France at speeds that shocked military observers on both sides. Patton's aggressive leadership style and his emphasis on speed and momentum were perfectly suited for this type of warfare. His forces advanced with a fury that German commanders had not experienced since their own blitzkrieg campaigns earlier in the war. On some days, American armoured divisions advanced 50 to 80 miles, liberating town after town with minimal resistance as German forces fell back in disarray. The speed of advance created tactical opportunities that exceeded even the most optimistic pre-invasion planning. Paris, which planners had thought might take months to reach, was suddenly within striking distance just weeks after the breakout. American forces liberated Chartres on August 18th. Le Mans had fallen on August 8th. Orléans was freed on August 16th. The map of liberated France was changing daily, sometimes hourly. But this spectacular success created problems that no amount of pre-war planning had adequately addressed. Sergeant Levada Hall, a 22-year-old truck driver from Georgia serving with the 666th Quartermaster Truck Company, one of the many segregated African-American units in the Army, wrote home to his family in early August 1944. His letter captured the urgency and danger of the situation. Our tanks are moving so fast across this country that they're literally running out of gas in the middle of their advance. Yesterday I delivered fuel to a Sherman tank that had stalled just 5 miles from the German lines. The crew was sitting there, completely vulnerable, unable to move or fight, just waiting for us to arrive with jerry cans of gasoline. When I handed them those cans, they looked at me like I had just saved their lives. Because I had. Without fuel, the best tank in the best world is just an expensive pillbox. By mid-August 1944, the fuel crisis had become critical. Patton's Third Army and Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' First Army together were consuming 800,000 gallons of gasoline every single day. To put that in perspective, that's enough fuel to fill over 160,000 jerry cans daily. Each Sherman tank required approximately 5 gallons of fuel to move just 1 mile on roads. Each armored division needed 30,000 gallons daily, merely to maintain offensive operations, not even counting the requirements for defensive maneuvers or tactical repositioning. Multiply that by dozens of divisions spread across hundreds of miles of front, add the fuel requirements for trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and support vehicles, and the numbers became almost incomprehensible. The supply dumps in Normandy held adequate stocks of fuel and ammunition. Ships were arriving daily from England and America with more supplies, but those supplies were 300 miles from where they were needed. And every mile further the armies advanced made the problem exponentially worse. The Allied supply chain was stretched to its breaking point, and something had to be done immediately or the entire advance would grind to a halt. The logistics crisis threatened to turn tactical victory into strategic stalemate. Staff officers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force worked around the clock calculating supply requirements, available transportation capacity, and delivery timelines. The numbers painted a grim picture. At current rates of advance and consumption, American forces would outrun their supply lines within weeks. German forces, though battered and demoralized, would gain time to establish new defensive positions. The opportunity to end the war quickly might be lost. Colonel Andrew McNair, a logistics planner at First Army Headquarters, later described the desperate atmosphere. We faced an Ams-Payne's impossible equation. Our combat forces were advancing faster than we had ever dared imagine, which was militarily brilliant, but they were consuming supplies faster than we could deliver them, which was logistically catastrophic. The Normandy ports and beaches could handle the volume. We had the supplies, but we couldn't physically move them to the front fast enough using conventional methods. We needed something radical, something unprecedented. We needed to turn every available truck into a dedicated supply vehicle and run them continuously until the crisis passed. The solution came on August 21st, 1944, when Allied logistics officers implemented one of the most ambitious truck convoy systems ever attempted. They called it the Red Ball Express, borrowing railroad terminology where Red Ball trains received priority handling over all other traffic. The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. A dedicated highway system would be established with one-way traffic routes heading toward the front and parallel return routes coming back. All other military traffic would be prohibited from these roads. Military police would control all intersections. Trucks would travel in convoys with minimal stopping, maintaining steady movement 24 hours a day. Priority would be given to delivering the specific supplies that combat units needed most urgently, particularly gasoline and ammunition. The backbone of this system would be the GMC CCKW, a 2.5-ton cargo truck that had entered production in 1941. The designation CCKW was simple Army nomenclature. C meant 1941 model year, C meant all-wheel drive, K meant tandem rear axles, and W meant dual rear wheels. But to the men who drove them and the mechanics who maintained them, these trucks were simply known as deuce and a halves or Jimmy trucks. They were not impressive machines by most standards. The cab was Spartan with minimal creature comforts. 2-bucket. Seats provided seating for driver and assistant driver. A canvas top offered minimal weather protection. The dashboard was basic with only essential gauges. There was no radio in most models, no heater, no power steering, no power brakes. The engine was a GMC Model 270 inline 6-cylinder gasoline engine, displacing 270 cubic inches and producing 91 horsepower at 2,800 revolutions per minute. This was the same basic engine used in GMC commercial trucks throughout the 1930s. It was reliable, simple to maintain, and parts were readily available. The transmission was a 5-speed manual with a 2-speed transfer case, giving the truck 10 forward gears and 2 reverse gears when 4-wheel drive was engaged. Top speed was approximately 45 miles per hour on good roads, though most drivers rarely exceeded 35 miles per hour when fully loaded for safety and fuel economy. The truck bed measured 12 feet long by 6 feet wide, with wooden sides that could be raised or lowered. A canvas tarp covered the cargo area, supported by wooden bows. The standard payload was 5,000 pounds, though drivers routinely overloaded their vehicles to 6,000 or 7,000 pounds when urgency demanded. The truck weighed approximately 8,800 pounds empty, meaning a fully loaded vehicle weighed nearly 15,000 pounds. The wheelbase was 145 inches, and the overall length was approximately 22 feet. Ground clearance was 10 inches, adequate for most off-road conditions encountered in Europe. What made the CCKW truly exceptional was not any single advanced feature, but rather the thoughtful integration of proven, reliable components into a design optimized for mass production and field maintenance. Every part of the truck had been selected with serviceability in mind. The engine could be removed and replaced in under 4 hours by a competent maintenance crew using basic tools. The transmission was robust and straightforward, with synchromesh gears that made shifting easier for less experienced drivers who hadn't mastered double-clutching techniques. The electrical system was simple 12-volt design with minimal wiring, reducing potential failure points and simplifying troubleshooting. The brakes were hydraulic 4-wheel drums, effective and reliable with technology proven in civilian applications. The suspension used leaf springs front and rear, crude by passenger car standards but nearly indestructible under truckloads. The fuel system was elegantly simple. A mechanical fuel pump drew gasoline from the single 40-gallon tank and delivered it to a single-barrel carburetor. No electronics, no complex metering systems, nothing that required specialized knowledge to repair. A competent mechanic could rebuild the entire fuel system in under an hour, with parts that fit in a small toolbox. The cooling system was equally straightforward, using a belt-driven water pump to circulate coolant through a simple radiator. When problems occurred, diagnosis was quick, and repairs were usually simple. By the time the Red Ball Express began operations, GMC had already produced over 150,000 CCKWs, and production continued at a rate of thousands per month. The truck was being manufactured at GMC facilities in Pontiac, Michigan, and Yellow Truck and Coach facilities. Additional production was happening at subsidiary plants across the Midwest industrial heartland. This massive production capacity, a triumph of American industrial might, meant that replacement vehicles were always available when trucks were destroyed or worn beyond economical repair. It also meant that spare parts were abundant, standardized across all production batches, and readily available at every maintenance depot in the theater of operations. The men selected to drive Red Ball Express trucks came from across the American military establishment. Many were from quartermaster truck companies, specialized units that had been trained and equipped specifically for cargo transportation operations. These men had received instruction in convoy operations, vehicle maintenance, map reading, and the fundamentals of military logistics. They understood that their mission was just as important as that of infantrymen or tank crews, even if it lacked the glory and public recognition of combat roles. A significant percentage of Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers serving in racially segregated units, a shameful reflection of the United States military's discriminatory policies in 1944. The United States military was still strictly segregated by race, with black soldiers assigned primarily to support roles rather than combat positions. This racist policy, which would not be fully dismantled until President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, meant that some of America's most capable truck drivers and mechanics were assigned to quartermaster companies specifically because they were black, regardless of their skills, education, or capabilities in other military specialties. Private First Class Leon Bass from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, serving with the 658th Quartermaster Truck Company, later recalled his experiences with a mixture of pride and pain. We knew we were driving into history, even if nobody back home would know our names. Every night we loaded those trucks with gasoline, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, whatever the frontline units needed most urgently. Then we drove through darkness on roads we barely knew, through territory that had been enemy-held just days or hours earlier, bringing supplies that would keep American soldiers alive and fighting. The work was exhausting, dangerous, and absolutely essential, but we did it in segregated units, eating in separate mess halls, sleeping in separate barracks, treated as second-class soldiers even as we performed first-class service. The organizational structure of the Red Ball Express reflected military efficiency at its best. Truck companies were assigned specific routes and schedules. Convoys departed supply depots at designated times with specific cargo loads matched to front-line requirements. Communication systems, though primitive by modern standards, kept headquarters informed of convoy locations and allowed adjustments when problems occurred. Maintenance units were positioned along routes to handle breakdowns quickly. Fuel stops were pre-planned and supplied. Rest areas allowed driver changes without stopping convoy movement. The Red Ball Express officially began operations on August 25, 1944, the same day that Paris was liberated by Allied forces. The initial routes ran from supply depots near the Normandy beaches, particularly the major depot complex at Saint-Lô, to forward supply points near Chartres, approximately 180 miles to the east. As American forces continued advancing eastward toward the German border, these routes were repeatedly extended, eventually reaching all the way to Sommessieux, over 300 miles from the starting points on the Normandy coast. The system operated with strict protocols, specifically designed to maximize efficiency and ensure the safety of drivers who would spend most of their waking hours on these dangerous roads. Convoys typically consisted of 5 to 40 trucks traveling together in organized formations, spaced approximately 60 yards apart to minimize casualties and damage if German air attack occurred. Each convoy had a designated lead vehicle carrying the convoy commander and a trail vehicle at the rear, both carrying military police or armed guards who were responsible for maintaining convoy integrity and providing security. Speed was carefully regulated to maintain steady flow rather than maximum velocity, because logistics planners had learned that consistent movement was more efficient than rapid bursts followed by stops and delays. Drivers quickly discovered that maintaining 35 miles per hour for hours on end delivered more cargo than trying to drive 50 miles per hour and having to stop frequently for maintenance, fuel, or accidents. The mathematics of logistics favored reliability over speed, consistency over performance. This lesson, learned through hard experience on French roads, would influence military logistics planning for generations to come. Stops were minimized and carefully coordinated to keep the entire system flowing smoothly without bottlenecks. Fuel stops happened at designated points along the route where fuel trucks were pre-positioned and ready to refill empty tanks quickly using gravity-fed hoses. Mechanics were stationed at maintenance stops with stocks of common replacement parts like fan belts, spark plugs, tires, and oil filters, ready to perform quick repairs that would get disabled trucks back on the road within minutes rather than hours. Rest stops were brief and strategically scheduled to prevent trucks from accumulating at any single location and creating traffic jams that would slow the entire operation. The routes themselves were marked with distinctive red balls painted on signs at every intersection and major junction, making navigation easier for exhausted drivers operating in darkness or poor weather conditions. These red ball signs became iconic symbols of the operation, instantly recognizable to anyone in France during those critical months. Military police controlled traffic at major intersections, ensuring that Red Ball trucks always had absolute priority over all other traffic without exception. French civilians quickly learned that trucks marked with red balls had right-of-way over everything, civilian vehicles and even other military convoys not part of the Red Ball system. The system was far from perfect, as any massive operation conducted under combat conditions inevitably encounters problems and inefficiencies. Accidents occurred regularly. Mechanical breakdowns were common. Weather sometimes forced schedule adjustments. German stragglers occasionally attacked isolated trucks. But despite all these challenges, the Red Ball Express worked far better than even optimistic planners had hoped. Corporal Eugene Hubbard from Columbus, Ohio, driving for the 497th Quartermaster Truck Company, described a typical Red Ball Express run in a letter home written in September 1944. You start driving in late afternoon when the light is fading, loading up at the depot while the sun sets behind you. Then you drive all night, headlights taped over with black tape so only thin slits of light show through, following the truck ahead by watching its barely visible taillights bobbing up and down on the rough road. Your assistant driver tries his best to stay awake to help navigate and watch for hazards like shell craters or disabled vehicles, but after 20 hours on duty, everyone is fighting sleep with every tool at their disposal. You drink terrible coffee whenever you can get it at the fuel stops, bitter and lukewarm but laden with enough caffeine to keep your eyes open for a few more hours. You eat cold rations while driving because stopping for proper meals wastes precious time that frontline soldiers don't have. Your hands cramp and ache from gripping the steering wheel hour after hour, the vibration numbing your fingers. Your back feels like someone is driving nails into your spine from the constant jarring transmitted through the crude suspension. Your eyes burn from staring into darkness for hours, watching for the dim taillights ahead and the red ball signs at intersections. Your mind plays tricks on you, making you see things that aren't there in the darkness, phantoms created by exhaustion and desperation. And through all of this, you keep driving because you know that men you'll never meet, soldiers fighting on the front lines whose names you'll never learn, are depending on you to arrive on time with the supplies they need to survive and complete their mission. The scale of the Red Ball Express operation was staggering by any measure, representing one of the largest logistics operations ever attempted up to that point in military history. At peak operation in early September 1944, over 5,000 trucks were dedicated to the Red Ball Express system, driven by approximately 23,000 soldiers working in carefully coordinated shifts around the clock. On the best days, when weather cooperated and mechanical problems were minimal, the system delivered 12,000 tons of supplies to forward units in a single 24-hour period. That's equivalent to over 600 fully loaded truck convoys completing their round trips successfully every day. The routes operated continuously without pause, with trucks moving in both directions simultaneously on parallel one-way roads that had been designated exclusively for Red Ball Express use. Empty trucks returning to supply depots used the westbound route, covering the same distance but carrying no cargo beyond their own weight. Loaded trucks heading toward the front lines used the eastbound route, groaning under the weight of 5,000 to 7,000 pounds of critical supplies. At any given moment during the height of operations, thousands of trucks were in motion on these roads, a seemingly endless river of olive-drab steel flowing toward the sound of distant guns. The statistics were impressive on paper and told a compelling story of massive scale and organization, but they only captured part of the reality of what was being accomplished on those French roads. Behind every number in the official logistics reports was a human being enduring conditions that would have seemed impossible before the war and barely believable even to those experiencing them. Drivers regularly worked 20-hour shifts, followed by brief rest periods of 4 to 6 hours before starting again. The human body and mind were never designed for such sustained stress. The monotony of long-distance driving over the same routes repeatedly, combined with severe sleep deprivation that dulled reflexes and clouded judgment, created constant danger of accidents that often proved fatal. Single-vehicle accidents caused by drivers falling asleep at the wheel were disturbingly common and claimed lives regularly. The roads themselves were hazardous obstacle courses, damaged by years of war and neglect during German occupation, then further damaged by months of heavy military traffic rolling over surfaces never designed for such continuous punishment. Potholes could swallow a wheel, rough patches could shake a truck apart, curves could catch an inattentive driver and send his truck tumbling off the road. Vehicles broke down regularly despite the CCKW's well-earned reputation for reliability, because even the most robust machines have absolute limits when pushed to extremes day after day without adequate rest. Engines overheated in summer weather and had to be carefully nursed back to operating temperature. Transmissions failed under the constant strain of heavy loads and rough roads. Tires blew out from overloading and poor road conditions. Brakes wore down from constant use and sometimes failed catastrophically. Fan belts broke and left engines unable to cool themselves. Fuel pumps quit without warning. Electrical systems developed mysterious problems that took hours to diagnose and repair. And when these breakdowns occurred, mechanics worked around the clock in shifts to keep as many trucks as possible operational and moving toward the front. The pressure was relentless and the stakes were impossibly high. Technical Sergeant Raymond Alexander from Detroit, Michigan, a maintenance supervisor with the 515th Quartermaster Battalion, kept meticulously detailed records of his unit's operations throughout the entire Red Ball Express period. His reports, carefully preserved in military archives, reveal the unglamorous and exhausting reality of keeping hundreds of trucks operational under combat conditions far from proper repair facilities with limited parts and tools. In a typical week during September 1944, we performed major repairs requiring engine removal or transmission replacement on 40 to 50 trucks. Another 100 vehicles needed what we classified as minor repairs, though these included brake work, electrical system troubleshooting, and fuel system cleaning that could take several hours each. We worked 3 shifts around the clock, mechanics sleeping a few hours in tents next to the motor pool before returning to work on the never-ending stream of broken trucks. Parts shortages were constant despite the generally excellent Army supply system, because consumption exceeded even optimistic projections made before operations began. We improvised solutions when official parts weren't available, fabricated replacement parts from scrap metal using welding equipment and basic machine tools, and scrounged whatever we needed from wherever we could find it, including damaged trucks being sent to depot-level facilities for major overhaul. If a truck could move under its own power and stop when the driver hit the brakes, we considered it operational and sent it back on the road toward the front. If it couldn't be repaired quickly with available parts and tools, we cannibalized it ruthlessly for components to fix 3 or 4 other vehicles. We became experts at making do with what we had, rather than waiting for what we needed, because waiting meant soldiers didn't get supplies and soldiers without supplies died. The reliability of the GMC CCKW was absolutely crucial to the system's success and made the difference between barely adequate logistics and complete failure. The truck's simple, robust design meant that most problems could be diagnosed and fixed quickly by mechanics with basic training and the limited tools available under field conditions. The engine, while not particularly powerful compared to some other military vehicles, was nearly indestructible when given proper maintenance with regular oil changes and basic preventive care. The transmission rarely failed catastrophically unless severely abused by inexperienced drivers who didn't understand proper shifting techniques. The drivetrain was deliberately overbuilt, engineered with substantial safety factors that allowed it to handle loads well beyond the truck's official rated capacity without immediate damage. The chassis was constructed from heavy-gauge steel that could survive rough roads, occasional nearby mine blasts, and the inevitable collisions that occurred in nighttime convoy operations. This extraordinary reliability came from conscious design choices made years before the war by GMC engineers, who understood that military vehicles needed to prioritize durability and maintainability over performance, sophistication. They had deliberately prioritized proven components with long service histories over newer, potentially better but unproven alternatives. They chose simple systems that could be serviced by average mechanics with basic tools rather than complex systems requiring specialists with extensive training and specialized equipment. These decisions, which might have seemed conservative or unambitious in peacetime when performance metrics and efficiency drove civilian vehicle design, proved exactly right for the brutal demands of global warfare conducted across multiple continents. A truck that worked reliably every single day for months on end was infinitely more valuable than a more capable truck that broke down frequently and required specialized maintenance that wasn't available thousands of miles from proper facilities. The contrast between American and German logistics capabilities was stark and telling, revealing fundamental differences in industrial philosophy, military planning, and organizational culture. German military forces in World War II used a bewildering variety of trucks from different manufacturers, both German-made and captured from occupied nations, each model with unique parts, specifications, and specific maintenance requirements that created nightmares for supply officers. German logistics units struggled constantly with parts, shortages, and maintenance challenges created by this catastrophic lack of standardization. Many German trucks had been requisitioned from civilian use and were never designed for the punishment of continuous military service under combat conditions. They lacked the durability needed for sustained operations far from repair facilities. The famous German Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 through 1941 had relied heavily on captured vehicles from defeated nations, creating an ever-worsening logistics nightmare of incompatible equipment that became more chaotic with each new conquest. French trucks used different parts than Polish trucks, which used different parts than Soviet trucks, which used different parts than German trucks. By 1944, German military logistics was in complete chaos, with thousands of different vehicle types requiring thousands of different spare parts that were often unavailable or in critically short supply. Mechanics needed encyclopedic knowledge of multiple systems. Parts, warehouses needed impossibly large inventories. The inefficiency was staggering and grew worse as the war continued. American logistics, by sharp contrast, benefited enormously from ruthless standardization that had been enforced from the earliest days of rearmament. The GMC CCKW was one of only a handful of standard truck models used throughout the American military in all theaters of operation worldwide. Parts were completely interchangeable between vehicles, regardless of which factory produced them or which production batch they came from. Mechanics trained on one CCKW could confidently service any other CCKW they encountered anywhere in the world. Maintenance procedures were rigorously standardized and thoroughly documented in technical manuals available to every unit down to company level. This standardization multiplied the effectiveness of every maintenance unit and every stockpile of spare parts by orders of magnitude. It also meant that damaged trucks could be quickly repaired using parts cannibalized from other damaged trucks, with destroyed vehicles serving as parts donors for multiple repairs instead of being simply discarded. Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Miller, a senior logistics officer with 1st Army Headquarters, later wrote about this crucial advantage in his detailed official after-action report submitted after the war ended. The Germans had better tanks in many respects, particularly in armor thickness and main gun power. They had more combat-experienced tank crews after years of warfare across Europe and North Africa. They had superior defensive positions after months to prepare fortifications. But they couldn't move supplies efficiently from their depots to their front-line units because their logistics system was hopelessly fragmented, grotesquely inefficient, and increasingly overwhelmed by the complexity of supporting so many different vehicle types with inadequate industrial capacity. Our logistics system, built around standardized vehicles like the CCKW and staffed by well-trained personnel who understood their mission, could deliver supplies anywhere we needed them, with remarkable reliability and efficiency. This gave us operational flexibility that the Germans simply could not match regardless of their tactical skills or fighting spirit. We could attack wherever and whenever we chose, confident that supplies would follow our advancing forces. The Germans were forced to defend everywhere because they couldn't concentrate forces quickly enough to respond effectively to our initiatives. But even reliability and standardization alone could not fully overcome the fundamental physical and mathematical challenges facing the Red Ball Express as autumn approached. The distances were simply too great, the demand too high, the roads too poor, and the conditions too difficult for any system, no matter how well organized or efficiently run, to fully satisfy the voracious requirements of the rapidly advancing Allied armies. By early September 1944, even this massive truck convoy system employing thousands of vehicles and tens of thousands of dedicated personnel was struggling mightily to keep pace with forces that had advanced hundreds of miles from their starting points on the Normandy beaches. Patton's Third Army, now operating hundreds of miles from supply depots in Normandy, was consuming more fuel in the transportation of supplies than was actually being delivered for tactical operations and combat. The mathematics were brutal and inexorable, governed by the simple physics of distance and fuel consumption. A truck that travelled 600 miles round trip from Normandy, supply depots to forward positions near the German border, consumed approximately 120 gallons of fuel for the complete journey, including return to base. If that same truck was carrying 200 gallons of fuel in jerry cans for delivery to combat units, only 80 gallons actually remained for tanks and other combat vehicles after subtracting the fuel consumed by the delivery process itself. That's a delivery efficiency of just 40%, meaning more fuel was consumed by the logistics system than was delivered to the intended users. As distances continued increasing with each day's advance toward Germany, the percentage of delivered fuel consumed by the delivery system itself grew to completely unsustainable levels that threatened to halt all offensive operations. On September 2, 1944, Patton wrote in his personal diary with evident and intense frustration about the maddening situation his forces faced. "My Third Army has the Germans on the run across France. Their army is shattered and demoralized after catastrophic defeats in Normandy. We could be across the Rhine River and deep into Germany within weeks, possibly ending this war before Christmas, if we had adequate fuel and ammunition stocks to sustain operations. Instead, we are being forced to significantly slow our advance, giving the enemy precious time they desperately need to reorganize their shattered forces and establish new defensive lines that will cost thousands of Allied lives to break. We are not being stopped by German military resistance on the battlefield, which we are defeating wherever we encounter it. We are being stopped by the fundamental limitations of our own logistics system, which cannot keep pace with our tactical success. It is maddening beyond words to have complete tactical victory within our grasp, to have the enemy beaten and retreating in disorder, but be unable to exploit the situation fully because trucks simply cannot deliver supplies fast enough across these increasingly long distances from Normandy to the front lines. The next day, facing this harsh logistical reality that no amount of determination could overcome, Allied command made a controversial strategic decision that would shape the remainder of the European campaign and generate heated debate among military historians for decades to come. General Eisenhower, balancing multiple competing demands and political pressures, implemented what became known as the broad front strategy, rather than concentrating all available resources on a single concentrated thrust toward Germany. This decision meant that available supplies would be distributed among multiple armies operating along a wide front, rather than concentrated in one sector, for a potentially decisive breakthrough attempt that might end the war quickly, but carried significant risks. The Red Ball Express would continue operating at maximum capacity with every available truck and driver, but the strategic emphasis shifted from supporting rapid advance by concentrated forces to sustaining armies along a wide front, while logistics infrastructure gradually caught up with the tactical situation. New ports would be opened closer to the front. Railroads would be repaired and brought back into operation. Pipelines would be constructed to deliver fuel more efficiently. The breathing space purchased by slowing the advance would allow these systems to be established. This decision generated enormous controversy among Allied commanders and revealed deep divisions in strategic thinking at the highest levels. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery argued passionately and persistently for a concentrated thrust through the Low Countries and Holland toward the Ruhr industrial region of Germany, claiming he could end the war by Christmas 1944 if given supply priority. Patton advocated equally passionately and forcefully for a concentrated drive through eastern France toward the Saar region and then into southern Germany, claiming his Third Army could reach Berlin before the Soviet armies if properly supported. Both men sincerely believed that adequate logistics support focused exclusively on their sector would enable them to end the war quickly and save countless lives by avoiding months of additional fighting. Eisenhower, carefully balancing multiple strategic considerations including post-war political arrangements with the Soviets, pressure from Washington and London to keep both American and British forces fully engaged, and the practical reality that logistics simply couldn't support a single concentrated thrust, chose the cautious, broad front approach that distributed risk and resources more evenly. The Red Ball Express continued intensive operations through November 16, 1944, operating continuously for 83 days without a break. During that remarkable period that pushed men and machines to their absolute limits, the system delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies to frontline units spread across France and into Belgium and Luxembourg. Over 75,000 individual trips were completed successfully by approximately 5,700 trucks driven by the 23,000 soldiers who rotated through the system during those 83 exhausting days. The average trip length was approximately 600 miles round trip from depot to delivery point and back, taking an average of 54 hours to complete, including loading time, transit, unloading, and return journey. This meant that each individual truck completed approximately 1.5 trips per week on average, spending most of its operational time actually moving on roads rather than stationary at loading or unloading points. The human cost of this achievement was significant and sobering, though it rarely appears in official histories that focus on tonnages delivered and distances travelled rather than human suffering endured. Accidents, primarily single-vehicle crashes caused by driver fatigue, claimed numerous lives throughout the operation. Several hundred drivers were injured seriously enough to require evacuation to military hospitals for extended treatment and recovery. Thousands more suffered from extreme exhaustion that required medical intervention for conditions ranging from severe malnutrition to what we would now recognize as combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress disorder. The psychological toll of driving 20-hour shifts through potentially hostile territory, knowing that mechanical failure, enemy action, or simple driver error could result in death at any moment, was immense and left lasting scars on many participants. Private First Class Charles Stevenson from Newark, New Jersey, serving with the 708th Quartermaster Truck Company, kept a personal diary throughout his service that captured the psychological strain better than any official report. September 15, 1944. Day 43 of continuous Red Ball Express operations without a real break. I honestly can't remember when I last slept more than 4 consecutive hours. The exhaustion is deeper and more profound than anything I've ever experienced in my entire life. Not just physical tiredness from long hours of driving and minimal rest, but a bone-deep weariness that makes clear thinking difficult and slows reaction times dangerously. We lost another driver yesterday when his truck went off the road during a night run on a curve near Reims. Nobody knows for certain if he fell asleep at the wheel, or if mechanical failure caused the accident, or if he swerved to avoid something in the road. The investigation will probably never determine the true cause. Either way, he's dead and buried in French soil far from home, and the rest of us are still driving. We're always driving. The road never ends. The convoys never stop moving. The war machine demands constant feeding, and we are the ones who must feed it regardless of the personal cost to ourselves. Yet despite these terrible hardships and the heavy toll they extracted, these men persevered day after day, night after night, because they clearly understood what was at stake. Every gallon of fuel they successfully delivered kept American tanks moving toward Germany and ultimate victory. Every crate of ammunition they hauled to the front allowed American infantry to continue fighting and defeating German forces. Every box of rations they transported sustained American soldiers in the field and kept them combat effective. Their unglamorous work, performed far from the front lines in roles that rarely received recognition from the public or even from other soldiers who benefited from their efforts, was absolutely essential to Allied victory in Europe. They knew this truth in their bones and drew strength from it, even if few others understood or appreciated what they were accomplishing under such extraordinarily difficult conditions. The technological and organizational lessons learned from the Red Ball Express influenced military logistics planning and operations for decades afterward, and continue to shape American military doctrine today. The United States Army formally adopted dedicated supply route systems with absolute priority handling as standard operating procedure for all major operations in subsequent conflicts. The emphasis on vehicle reliability and field maintainability became central to military procurement decisions, with contracts specifying not just performance metrics but also ease of maintenance under austere field conditions. Standardization of equipment and parts became a fundamental, non-negotiable principle of military logistics planning at all organizational levels from theater command down to individual units. The understanding that logistics capacity must be planned and resourced just as carefully as combat operations became deeply embedded in military doctrine and institutional culture. The GMC CCKW itself became legendary within military circles and among veterans who had served with or depended upon these trucks. Over 560,000 CCKWs were produced during World War II, serving in every theatre of operations from the scorching deserts of North Africa to the steaming jungles of the Pacific Islands to the freezing roads of Northern Europe. The basic design proved so successful and adaptable that it continued in production with gradual modifications for decades after the war ended in 1945. Thousands of surplus CCKWs were sold to civilian users after the military downsized, finding second careers as farm, trucks, construction vehicles, utility trucks, and general cargo haulers throughout the world. Many of these rugged trucks are still in operation today, over 80 years after the original design was introduced, serving as living testament to the soundness of the original engineering and the quality of wartime construction. Modern military trucks owe a direct lineage to the CCKW design philosophy and the lessons learned from its wartime service. The emphasis on simple, reliable, maintainable vehicles capable of operating in harsh conditions with minimal external support remains absolutely central to military logistics vehicle design. The current family of medium tactical vehicles used by the United States military follows principles that were firmly established by the CCKW over 80 years ago. Standardization, reliability, and field maintainability continue to be more important selection criteria than peak performance or impressive technological sophistication when military planners choose logistics, vehicles, because the lessons of the Red Ball Express demonstrated conclusively that vehicles must work consistently under difficult conditions over extended periods, rather than perform impressively under ideal conditions for brief intervals. The racial dynamics and social injustice of the Red Ball Express also deserve honest recognition and examination, uncomfortable as that history may be. Approximately 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers serving in racially segregated quartermaster units, reflecting the deeply discriminatory and morally indefensible military policies of the United States in 1944. These men faced all the physical danger and mental exhaustion of the operation, while simultaneously enduring the added burden and profound indignity of military segregation based solely on the color of their skin. They were deemed good enough to risk their lives daily delivering supplies that kept the entire Allied advance moving forward, but not good enough to serve alongside white soldiers in integrated units or to receive equal treatment in all aspects of military and civilian life. This glaring contradiction between the principles America claimed to fight for and the racist reality of American society was not lost on the black soldiers themselves, or on the more perceptive and morally conscious observers of the Bratties. Time. Private First Class John Houston from Baltimore, Maryland, serving with the 664th Quartermaster Truck Company, wrote to his family in September 1944 with eloquence and restrained anger that captured this painful and infuriating irony: "We drive trucks that keep this entire army moving and fighting across France. White soldiers treat us with genuine respect and heartfelt gratitude when we deliver the supplies they desperately need to survive and complete their combat missions. They shake our hands warmly and thank us sincerely because they clearly understand that we're saving their lives by bringing fuel and ammunition to the front lines where they face German guns. But back at our own camps, away from the immediate pressures and dangers of the front lines, we still eat in separate mess halls designated for colored troops only and sleep in separate barracks away from white soldiers. We fight the same Nazi enemy that preaches racial supremacy, serve the same American country that claims to champion freedom and equality, wear the same olive drab uniform that marks us as United States Army soldiers, risk our lives daily under the same dangers from enemy action and exhaustion. But we're still not considered fully equal citizens or soldiers worthy of complete respect and fair treatment. The bitter irony burns like acid in our souls, But we continue to do our duty with pride and professionalism because this war against fascism is bigger than our personal treatment and mistreatment. We're fighting for freedom abroad while desperately hoping and praying that someday we'll have full freedom and equality at home in America, the country of our birth. The experiences of African American soldiers in the Red Ball Express and other logistics units throughout World War II contributed significantly to the eventual desegregation of the American military and the broader civil rights movement. These men proved beyond any possible doubt or reasonable argument that black soldiers could perform critical military functions just as well as anyone else, under the most demanding and dangerous conditions imaginable, with the same dedication, skill, courage, and professionalism. Their exemplary service completely undermined the racist justifications and pseudo-scientific arguments that had been cynically used to defend military segregation for generations, though meaningful change came frustratingly and inexcusably slowly, even after such clear and overwhelming proof of equal capability and commitment. The military would not fully desegregate until 1948, when President Harry Truman courageously issued Executive Order 9981, requiring equal treatment and opportunity for all service members, regardless of race, color, religion, or national origin. Many Red Ball Express veterans became leaders and activists in the civil rights movement after returning home from the war. They had proven themselves capable under fire and extreme conditions that would have broken lesser men. They had endured hardships and discrimination that tested their patience and resolve. They had contributed decisively to Allied victory and the defeat of Nazi fascism in Europe. They returned home with justified confidence, practical skills, strong organizational abilities, and iron determination to fight for the equality and respect they had been systematically denied throughout their lives. Their military service gave them unassailable moral authority and hard-won confidence to demand the rights they deserved as American citizens and decorated combat veterans who had served their country with distinction and honor. As autumn turned to winter in 1944, the Red Ball Express was gradually phased out and deactivated, as other logistics systems came online and reduced the desperate dependence on long-distance truck transportation. The vital port of Antwerp in Belgium was captured by Allied forces in early September, and finally opened to Allied shipping in late November after extensive and dangerous mine-clearing operations in the Scheldt estuary, dramatically shortening supply routes by eliminating the need to haul everything hundreds of miles from the Normandy beaches. Railroad lines throughout France and Belgium were systematically repaired and reopened by skilled military railway units working around the clock, allowing trains to carry bulk supplies much more efficiently than trucks could ever manage. Major pipeline construction projects brought fuel delivery capacity progressively closer to frontline units, with the first pipelines becoming operational in October and expanding through November. The acute logistics emergency was finally over, though the fundamental need for extensive truck transportation remained absolutely critical throughout the remainder of the war in Europe. The final statistics of the Red Ball Express tell an impressive story of extraordinary achievement accomplished through determination, sacrifice, and refusal to accept defeat. 412,000 tons of supplies delivered successfully across 300 miles of French and Belgian roads under combat conditions. 75,000 round trips completed despite all obstacles including mechanical failures, accidents, weather, and occasional enemy action. Over 133 million ton-miles accomplished, a standard logistics measurement that combines cargo weight with distance traveled to provide a meaningful metric of transportation work performed. At peak operation in early September, the system moved over 600 tons of supplies per truck company per day, an impressive rate that exceeded initial projections and demonstrated what determined soldiers could accomplish. Individual trucks averaged approximately 200 miles per day under load, a remarkable figure when considering poor road conditions, unpredictable weather challenges, inevitable mechanical problems, and mandatory maintenance requirements. But statistics alone, impressive and important as they are for historical record, cannot possibly capture the full human dimension of this achievement or adequately represent the price paid by those who made it possible. Behind every cold number in the official logistics reports was a living, breathing person making difficult choices under extreme pressure, enduring genuine physical and mental hardship that left permanent scars and contributing to something much larger than themselves. The Red Ball Express succeeded because thousands of ordinary men, not superhuman heroes but regular soldiers doing their duty, did extraordinary things consistently over extended periods under conditions that would have defeated less determined and committed individuals. They drove when exhausted beyond anything they had experienced in their civilian lives before the war. They kept driving when legitimately scared of accidents that could kill them or enemy action that could end their lives in an instant. They maintained complex vehicles under impossible conditions with inadequate tools and limited spare parts, improvising solutions when proper parts weren't available. They solved countless problems creatively and practically when official resources and standard procedures failed to address the specific challenges they faced. They supported each other emotionally and practically when times were hardest and individual spirits were lowest. They persevered steadily when quitting would have been easier, more comfortable, more understandable, and seemingly justified by the extreme hardships they endured day after day without relief. The GMC CCKW, the simple, unglamorous American truck that won the race across France, embodied timeless principles that extend far beyond narrow military logistics into every area of serious human endeavor. In any genuinely difficult undertaking, sustained reliability over extended time matters far more than impressive peak performance under carefully controlled ideal conditions. Elegant simplicity enables wider application, easier training, and simpler maintenance than seductive complexity that requires specialized knowledge and perfect conditions. Steady consistency over long periods dramatically outperforms sporadic, intermittent excellence that cannot be maintained when conditions deteriorate. These are fundamental truths that apply with equal force to tools and machines, to organizations and institutions, and to individual people facing serious challenges. The CCKW succeeded spectacularly, not because it was the absolute fastest truck available in 1944, or the most powerful, or the most technologically sophisticated and impressive, but because it worked reliably and consistently day after day, week after week, month after month under brutal conditions that quickly destroyed or disabled, more sophisticated vehicles that looked more impressive on paper but couldn't match its sustained real-world performance when conditions were difficult. Modern military logistics around the world still follows fundamental principles that were firmly established during the Red Ball Express 8 decades ago. The concept of dedicated supply routes with absolute priority handling over all other traffic became standard doctrine for all subsequent American military operations from Korea in the 1950s to Vietnam in the 60s and 70s to the Gulf War in 1991 to Iraq and Afghanistan in the 21st century. The emphasis on vehicle reliability and field maintainability over sophisticated technology and peak performance influenced every single military truck design that followed the legendary CCKW. The hard-won understanding that logistics capacity must be planned, resourced, and protected just as carefully as combat operations became deeply embedded in military doctrine and institutional culture at all levels, from strategic planning to tactical execution. The lessons learned through hard experience on French highways in the summer and fall of 1944 are still being carefully studied and thoughtfully applied on battlefields and in logistics operations around the world. Today, the race across France in the summer and fall of 1944 was ultimately won not by the fastest vehicles with the highest top speeds, but by the most reliable ones that kept moving when others broke down and stopped. Not by the most sophisticated technology with impressive specifications, but by the simplest, most practical designs that could be manufactured quickly in the enormous quantities needed for global war, operated effectively and safely by soldiers with minimal specialized training, and repaired successfully in austere field conditions with basic hand tools and average mechanical skills. Not by dramatic individual acts of heroism, though there were certainly thousands of those that went unrecognized and unrecorded, but by the quiet, collective determination of ordinary men doing extraordinarily difficult and dangerous work day after day, night after night, week after week, without public recognition, newspaper headlines, medals, glory, or heartfelt appreciation from those they served. The GMC CCKW and the tired, determined soldiers who drove it relentlessly accomplished what Germany's more technologically advanced weapons and more experienced, better-trained armies could not prevent or stop. They kept an entire liberating force of millions of men supplied adequately across 300 miles of contested territory for 83 continuous days without catastrophic systemic failure that would have halted operations. They demonstrated conclusively and permanently that logistics capacity, when properly organized, adequately resourced, and competently executed, can determine the final outcome of major military campaigns just as decisively as tactical brilliance, operational art, or technological superiority. They proved beyond doubt that ordinary men with ordinary equipment, when led competently and supplied adequately, can achieve extraordinary results that change history when they commit themselves fully and irrevocably to a mission that transcends their individual lives and comfort. General Dwight Eisenhower understood this profound truth deeply from hard-won experience. In his extensive wartime experiences and thoughtful post-war reflections, he consistently emphasized that without the massive, sustained supply efforts and the reliable transportation systems that supported them, the spectacular campaign of 1944 across France would have been absolutely impossible to execute or sustain. The remarkable efficiency of American soldiers at all levels, combined with the proven quality of American industrial equipment and the sophisticated organizational skill of American logistics personnel working at every level from strategic planning to tactical execution, gave Allied forces decisive advantages that their enemies simply could not match despite superior tactics and individual fighting skills. Better trucks that worked reliably, more trucks available in sufficient quantities, and capable soldiers who could keep them running and moving under extreme conditions that would defeat lesser men and inferior machines, made the crucial difference between victory and defeat. Wars are ultimately not won by machines alone, no matter how sophisticated or powerful, but reliable machines that consistently work when needed most, operated by determined, skilled men, absolutely refuse to quit regardless of obstacles and hardships, can fundamentally change the entire course of human history. The final meaningful chapter of the Red Ball Express story played out over 4 decades later, bringing the aging, greying veterans together one last time to remember and honor what they had accomplished together as young men. In July 1985, over 500 former Red Ball Express drivers gathered in Dallas, Texas, for an emotional reunion organized by dedicated veterans groups and generously supported by the Department of Defense. These elderly men, now comfortably settled in their 60s and 70s with grey hair, lined faces, and the quiet dignity of age, came from all across America to reconnect with old comrades and brothers in arms they hadn't seen or spoken with since the war ended 40 long years earlier. They shared long-cherished stories and faded memories. They showed carefully preserved photographs from 4 decades past. They remembered fallen friends who hadn't made it home, speaking their names with reverence and enduring sorrow that time had not diminished. The keynote speaker at the formal reunion banquet was former Corporal James Ruckard, whose experiences as a young, frightened, determined driver had opened this narrative 41 years earlier on a dark French road. Now 60 years old, successful, and working as a respected logistics manager for a major trucking company in Cleveland, he stood confidently before an audience of fellow veterans, active duty military officials, academic historians, and proud family members. His voice was still strong and clear as he spoke movingly about what they had accomplished together as young men and what their shared sacrifice meant not just to them personally but to world history and to all who value freedom. We drove those trucks through France and Belgium because it was our clear duty as American soldiers, Ruckard began with quiet conviction. We willingly endured conditions that would break most ordinary people because we knew American combat soldiers on the front lines were depending completely on us to deliver what they desperately needed to survive and fight effectively. We faced death daily, not primarily from enemy bullets and bombs, though that very real risk was always present in our minds, but from crushing exhaustion that dulled our reflexes and clouded our judgment, from accidents on dangerous roads in complete darkness, from the relentless sheer physical and mental demands of driving 20 consecutive hours straight through hostile territory, then doing it all over again. the very next day, and the day after that, without adequate rest or recovery time. He paused meaningfully, looking out over the assembled veterans with visible emotion, seeing black and white soldiers together in the audience, all growing inevitably old together but still powerfully bonded by shared service, shared sacrifice, and shared memories that transcended the racial divisions of their youth. And we prevailed against all obstacles and odds, because we had something vitally important that our enemies did not have and could not match. We had simple, honest trucks that were built primarily to work reliably under terrible conditions rather than to impress procurement officials with impressive specifications and performance numbers. We had competent, dedicated leaders at all levels who clearly understood that logistics matters just as much as combat tactics in modern industrialized warfare. And we had each other, men of different races and backgrounds, black soldiers and white soldiers, working together harmoniously toward a common goal that was infinitely bigger and more important than any of us as individuals. That unity of purpose and mutual respect earned under fire was something truly special and precious. Looking directly at his audience with intensity and conviction, Ruckard continued with gathering emotion, "I have spent 41 years thinking deeply about what we accomplished together in those exhausting 83 days that tested us beyond anything we thought humanly possible. The Red Ball Express delivered enormous quantities of supplies. Yes, hundreds of thousands of tons of vital material across hundreds of miles of dangerous, contested territory under combat conditions. But I sincerely believe we delivered something infinitely more important and lasting than gasoline and ammunition and rations. We delivered permanent, irrefutable proof that ordinary men, driving ordinary trucks, doing an ordinary job extraordinarily well, day after day without fail, can fundamentally change the entire course of human history in ways that matter forever. We proved conclusively that America's real strength comes not from having the fanciest, most expensive technology or the most sophisticated, impressive equipment that looks good in parades and procurement brochures, but from our fundamental national ability to design simple, practical solutions that actually work reliably under real-world conditions, and our stubborn cultural willingness to keep working steadily when others would quit and give up. That profound lesson is exactly as true today in 1985 as it was in 1944, and it will remain permanently true as long as difficult, important work needs to be done in an imperfect world, by imperfect people. The large auditorium erupted in sustained, thunderous applause that continued for several emotional minutes, with people standing and clapping until their hands actually hurt from the effort. Veterans stood together, many tightly embracing old comrades and friends they hadn't seen in decades, tears flowing freely and unashamedly down weathered cheeks as 40 years of carefully preserved memories came flooding back in an overwhelming emotional wave. Men who had driven together through dark French nights as nervous, scared youngsters now stood together as proud grandfathers, their deep bond unchanged and undiminished by 4 decades of time, distance, and separate lives. Outside in the sun-drenched parking lot, 3 beautifully restored GMC CCKWs sat impressively on display, their traditional olive drab paint and distinctive white star markings meticulously and lovingly maintained by dedicated collectors and passionate military history enthusiasts. Throughout the entire reunion weekend, veterans repeatedly took turns sitting in those achingly familiar driver's seats again, hands naturally gripping steering wheels they had last touched as young men in their 20s, feet instinctively working clutch and brake pedals worn smooth and shiny by millions of hard miles of wartime use. One particularly moving moment occurred when former Sergeant William Thompson from Philadelphia climbed slowly and carefully into the cab of one of the restored trucks with assistance from younger family members. He sat silently and motionlessly for several long minutes, both hands resting gently on the large steering wheel, eyes tightly closed as powerful memories from 4 decades past washed over him in waves. When he finally climbed back down with help, his lined face was unmistakably wet with tears he made absolutely no attempt to hide or apologize for. "I can still feel it all after all these years," he said to no one in particular, his voice breaking noticeably with raw emotion, the constant vibration through the steering wheel traveling up my arms, the distinctive sound of that reliable 6-cylinder engine, the unforgettable smell of canvas and gasoline and sweat and fear all mixed together. The crushing weight of responsibility knowing that lives literally depended on me getting through successfully with my precious cargo no matter what obstacles I encountered. For 40 years I've lived as a peaceful postal worker, a faithful husband, a loving father, a doting grandfather, living a quiet, comfortable civilian life in peacetime America. But for those few precious minutes sitting in that truck, I was 22 years old again, driving through the pitch-black night toward the front lines, scared and exhausted and simultaneously proud to be doing something that mattered more than anything I've done since that time. The GMC CCKW won the historic race across France not through superior speed or impressive technological sophistication that might wow engineers, but through simple, honest reliability, multiplied by unwavering human determination and refusal to quit. It succeeded spectacularly because it was simple enough to be mass-produced in the enormous quantities needed for global war on multiple continents, tough enough to survive and keep functioning under the inevitable abuse and harsh conditions of extended combat operations, practical enough to be maintained effectively with basic hand tools and minimal training by mechanics of average skill and experience, and honest enough in its straightforward design that it did exactly what it promised to do without pretension, exaggeration, or needless complication. The truck became permanently legendary not because it was demonstrably the best at any single narrowly defined measurable specification when compared point by point to other contemporary vehicles, but because it was consistently good enough at everything that actually mattered in harsh, real-world conditions over sustained operations lasting months. Today, over 80 years after the Red Ball Express successfully operated on the war-damaged roads of France and Belgium, military historians and professional logistics specialists around the world still carefully study the operation as a textbook example of successful large-scale logistics, executed effectively under extreme combat conditions and severe time pressure. Major business schools analyze it extensively as a valuable case study in supply chain management under maximum stress with inadequate resources. Leadership development courses examine it thoroughly for timeless lessons about effectively motivating diverse personnel during extended, difficult operations that test human limits. The operation clearly demonstrated fundamental principles that remain completely valid and applicable in any large-scale military campaign or complex civilian logistics operation, regardless of the dramatic technological changes that have occurred over 8 decades. Dedicated supply routes with absolute priority handling work dramatically better than mixed-use transportation networks with competing demands. Simple, reliable equipment consistently outperforms sophisticated, complex designs under sustained operational stress and imperfect field conditions. Well-led, properly motivated, determined personnel can overcome seemingly impossible challenges and achieve remarkable results when adequately supported with necessary resources and realistic guidance. Logistics capacity and supply chain effectiveness can be strategically decisive in major operations, sometimes proving more important than raw combat power or brilliant tactical maneuvering. Rigorous standardization and full interoperability multiply the effectiveness of any logistics system by orders of magnitude. These hard-won lessons, purchased with the precious sweat and blood of thousands of dedicated men on French roads in the summer and fall of 1944, continue to powerfully influence how modern armies and sophisticated civilian logistics organizations around the world organize, equip, train, and operate their complex supply chains. The simple, unpretentious American truck that won the race across France teaches us timeless, universal truths that extend far beyond narrow military logistics into every area of serious human endeavor and challenging situations that demand sustained excellence. In any genuinely difficult undertaking that tests human limits and organizational capabilities, ultimate success comes not necessarily to those with the most impressive tools or sophisticated technology that looks good in demonstrations, but to those who use practical, reliable tools effectively and consistently, while absolutely refusing to quit when inevitable obstacles and setbacks appear. Sustained reliability over extended time under stress matters infinitely more than impressive, peak performance achieved briefly under carefully controlled ideal conditions. Elegant simplicity enables widespread effective use and easier adaptation better than seductive complexity that requires specialized expertise, perfect conditions, and extensive support infrastructure. Steady determination and effective teamwork, working together harmoniously, achieve far more than isolated individual brilliance operating alone without support. These profound principles, perfectly embodied in the design and operation of the GMC CCKW and powerfully demonstrated by the historic success of the Red Ball Express, remain exactly as relevant and applicable today in our modern world as they were 80 years ago when young men drove through French darkness delivering the supplies that won a war and secured freedom for millions. The truck itself may now be completely obsolete, long since replaced by more modern vehicles with better performance capabilities and more sophisticated features. But the fundamental lessons it taught about reliability, simplicity, and unwavering human determination will never become obsolete or irrelevant. They are eternal, unchanging truths about how difficult things actually get accomplished in an imperfect world with limited resources and unlimited challenges by imperfect people who refuse to give up. The tired, determined men who drove those trucks through constant danger and crushing exhaustion to deliver victory understood something profound and precious that our modern society sometimes forgets in its endless pursuit of the newest and most advanced technology. Real strength doesn't fundamentally come from having the biggest weapon or the fastest vehicle or the most advanced, expensive technology with impressive specifications. Real strength comes from having equipment that works reliably when you need it most under the worst conditions, practical knowledge to fix problems quickly when they inevitably occur, and iron determination to keep moving forward steadily no matter what obstacles stand in your way or how difficult the journey becomes. They won the crucial race across France, and in winning it, they helped win the war and secure freedom for millions of people who would never know their names or fully understand their sacrifice. Their remarkable achievement stands forever as permanent testament to what ordinary people can accomplish when they commit themselves fully to an important mission that transcends their individual lives, equipped with simple tools designed primarily to work rather than to impress, and driven by an unshakable will to succeed regardless of difficulties. The GMC CCKW was just a truck, a practical collection of metal and rubber and glass assembled in factories in Michigan by workers who would never see the European battlefields where their product made history. But in the capable hands of determined men serving a cause infinitely larger than themselves, that simple, honest truck became the vehicle of liberation, the instrument of victory, and permanent proof that sometimes the most ordinary things, done extraordinarily well by ordinary people who absolutely refuse to quit, make all the difference in the world. The legacy of the Red Ball Express extended far beyond the 83 days of its operation and influenced American military thinking in profound ways. The operation demonstrated that logistics could be just as important as firepower in determining campaign outcomes. This lesson was reinforced in subsequent conflicts. During the Korean War from 1950 to 1953, American forces again relied heavily on truck transportation when communist forces interdicted rail lines and threatened ports. The same principles of dedicated routes, standardized vehicles, and determined personnel proved their worth once more on the mountainous roads of Korea. In Vietnam during the 1960s and 70s, American logistics operations faced even greater challenges in a tropical environment with limited road infrastructure and constant threat of ambush. Yet the fundamental lessons of the Red Ball Express remained applicable. Reliable trucks, properly maintained and operated by well-trained soldiers, moved supplies despite monsoons, jungle heat, and enemy action. The emphasis on simplicity and maintainability that characterized the CCKW influenced the design of the trucks used in Vietnam, which had to operate in conditions even more demanding than those faced in France. The Gulf War of 1991 provided perhaps the most dramatic modern validation of Red Ball Express principles. American forces deployed to Saudi Arabia faced the daunting challenge of moving enormous quantities of supplies hundreds of miles across desert terrain to support offensive operations against Iraqi forces. The solution looked remarkably similar to what had worked in France 47 years earlier. Dedicated supply routes were established across the desert. Thousands of trucks moved in organized convoys. Maintenance units kept vehicles operational under harsh conditions. The technology had advanced dramatically, with GPS navigation replacing map reading and modern diesel engines replacing gasoline power plants. But the fundamental organizational principles remained unchanged. Staff Sergeant Marcus Williams, a logistics specialist who served in the Gulf War, later reflected on the historical connections. We studied the Red Ball Express in our logistics courses. The lessons were clear and directly applicable, even though we were operating in a completely different environment with much more advanced equipment. You still need dedicated routes to prevent congestion. You still need standardized equipment so parts and maintenance procedures are consistent. You still need determined personnel who understand their mission is critical even though they're not pulling triggers. The technology changes, but the principles endure because they're based on fundamental realities of moving large quantities of supplies over long distances under difficult conditions. The Red Ball Express also influenced civilian logistics and transportation industries in ways that continue to shape modern commerce. The concept of dedicated truck routes with priority handling became standard practice in time-sensitive freight operations. Just-in-time manufacturing and delivery systems used by modern corporations owe intellectual debt to the efficiency principles developed under combat conditions in France. The emphasis on reliability and maintainability that characterized the CCKW influenced commercial truck design throughout the post-war decades. Fleet standardization became recognized as a key factor in controlling maintenance costs and improving operational efficiency in civilian trucking operations. Major logistics companies that emerged in the post-war era were often led by veterans who had learned their trade in military service. These men brought military logistics principles into civilian applications, transforming industries ranging from long-haul trucking to package delivery to supply chain management. The organizational skills developed managing military convoys translated directly into civilian logistics operations. The understanding that reliable delivery mattered more than maximum speed became foundational to successful freight companies. Fred Smith, the founder of FedEx Corporation, explicitly cited military logistics operations as inspiration for his overnight delivery concept. While Smith's service came later during the Vietnam era, he studied earlier military logistics operations including the Red Ball Express. His revolutionary hub and spoke distribution system, which transformed package delivery worldwide, applied military principles of centralized control and standardized procedures to civilian commerce. The idea that packages should be routed through central hubs rather than directly between cities paralleled military logistics' emphasis on consolidating cargo at supply depots before distributing to forward units. The human stories of Red Ball Express veterans also deserve recognition beyond their wartime service. These men returned home to build families, careers, and communities. They carried with them skills learned under fire and confidence earned through accomplishing difficult missions. Many found success in transportation and logistics industries where their practical experience gave them advantages over others. Some became business owners, starting small trucking companies that grew into substantial enterprises. Others worked for larger organizations, bringing military discipline and work ethic to civilian jobs. For African American veterans, the experience was particularly complex and often frustrating. They had proven themselves fully capable under the most demanding conditions imaginable. They had demonstrated courage, competence, and commitment equal to any soldiers in American history. Yet they returned home to a country that still denied them basic rights and opportunities based solely on race. Many became activists in the growing civil rights movement, determined to achieve at home the freedom they had fought for abroad. Their military service gave them moral authority and organizational skills that proved valuable in the long struggle for equality. James Ruckard, whose story opened and bookended this narrative, built a successful career in civilian logistics after the war. He worked his way up from truck driver to dispatcher to operations manager to vice president of logistics for a major Midwest trucking company. He never forgot the lessons learned on French roads. He emphasized reliability over flash, consistency over brilliance, teamwork over individual achievement. He mentored younger employees, teaching them that the fundamentals of logistics had not changed despite technological advances. He insisted on proper vehicle maintenance and realistic scheduling that didn't push drivers beyond safe limits. His employees respected him not just as a boss, but as someone who had proven himself under conditions they could barely imagine. Ruckard married his high school sweetheart in 1946 after returning from Europe. They raised 3 children in suburban Cleveland. He was active in veterans organizations, serving multiple terms as commander of his local American Legion post. He spoke occasionally at schools about his wartime experiences, though he always emphasized the unglamorous reality rather than romanticizing combat. He wanted young people to understand that war was terrible and necessary service was often boring, exhausting work rather than dramatic heroism. He stressed that ordinary people doing their jobs well had won the war more than battlefield theatrics. In his later years, Ruckard became something of a historian, corresponding with other Red Ball Express veterans and helping researchers who were studying the operation. He donated his personal diaries and photographs to the National Archives. He was interviewed extensively by military historians documenting logistics operations in World War II. He always insisted that the real heroes were the men who didn't come home, the drivers killed in accidents or enemy action, whose names appeared only in casualty reports rather than history books. The simple truth that Ruckard and his fellow drivers lived remains powerfully relevant in our modern age of constant technological change and innovation. The newest, most advanced solution is not always the best solution for real-world problems. Sometimes, simple, proven, reliable approaches work better than sophisticated alternatives that look impressive but fail under stress. The CCKW was not the most advanced truck of its era. Other vehicles had more power, better ride quality, more features, but the CCKW worked day after day, month after month, under conditions that destroyed more sophisticated machines. That reliable performance, multiplied across thousands of trucks and millions of miles, won the logistics battle that enabled military victory. This principle applies far beyond military operations or logistics. In any field, sustained, reliable performance beats sporadic brilliance. The doctor who consistently provides good care to all patients serves better than the occasionally brilliant surgeon who is unreliable. The teacher who effectively reaches most students most days accomplishes more than the inspirational teacher who burns out after 2 years. The business that delivers consistently adequate products reliably outperforms the company that produces occasional masterpieces between failures. The worker who shows up every day and does solid work becomes more valuable than the periodically brilliant colleague who is unreliable. The men of the Red Ball Express embodied this principle in their daily work. They were not superhuman heroes, they were ordinary men doing difficult work with determination and refusal to quit. That steady commitment to mission, maintained over 83 exhausting days, changed history. They proved that ordinary people, properly equipped and determined to succeed, can accomplish extraordinary things. That lesson resonates through time, offering hope and guidance to everyone facing difficult challenges. The GMC CCKW trucks themselves have become collector's items and historical artifacts. Hundreds have been lovingly restored by military vehicle enthusiasts who preserve these machines as rolling monuments to an important era. At military vehicle shows and historical reenactments, restored CCKWs draw crowds of admirers who want to see, touch, and photograph these legendary trucks. Veterans sometimes attend these events, reuniting with the vehicles they drove decades earlier. The sight of an old soldier climbing into a restored CCKW cab, hands automatically finding familiar controls, eyes misting with memories, reminds observers that these machines represent more than mechanical engineering. They represent human achievement, sacrifice, and determination. Museums devoted to World War II history prominently feature CCKWs in their collections. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans displays a Red Ball Express truck with interpretive materials explaining the operation's significance. The Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History includes CCKW components in its military history collections. Smaller regional museums across America often have CCKWs donated by local veterans or their families. These preserved vehicles serve as tangible connections to history, allowing new generations to understand what their grandparents and great-grandparents accomplished. The story of the Red Ball Express and its simple, reliable trucks ultimately teaches us that success in difficult endeavors requires several essential elements working together. First, practical tools designed for real-world conditions rather than ideal specifications. Second, proper maintenance and support infrastructure to keep those tools functioning. Third, competent leadership that understands the mission and organizes resources effectively. Fourth, trained personnel who know their jobs and do them well. Fifth, determination and refusal to quit when obstacles appear. And finally, belief in a cause larger than individual comfort or glory. When these elements combine, ordinary people achieve extraordinary results. The young men driving GMC CCKWs through French darkness in 1944 were not selected for special heroism or unique capabilities. They were simply soldiers doing their assigned jobs. But they did those jobs extraordinarily well, under conditions that would have defeated lesser commitment. They succeeded because they had reliable trucks, competent mechanics, effective organization, proper training, iron determination, and belief that their work mattered to something bigger than themselves. That combination of practical tools, good support, effective organization, solid training, unwavering determination, and commitment to mission remains the formula for success in any demanding endeavor. Technology changes. Specific challenges evolve. But these fundamental principles endure because they reflect basic truths about human achievement. The simple American trucks that won the race across France 8 decades ago taught lessons that remain valid today and will continue guiding future generations facing their own difficult challenges. Sometimes the most ordinary things, done extraordinarily well by people who refuse to quit, really do make all the difference in the world.